In the heart of Los Angeles, California, there is a hotel that many consider to be a place of pure evil. Built about 100 years ago, this hotel was meant to be a stop for middle class visitors and workers in LA. However, the hotel was soon struck by the effects of the Great Depression. And not only that, but many down on their luck visitors soon began taking their lives within the walls of this hotel. Due to this, the hotel was soon seen as a place where both dreams and people go to die. As the years went on, the hotel began to decline due to its proximity to Skid Row. Additionally, the hotel was forced to lower its prices on multiple occasions to keep itself afloat. But this only served to attract even more troublemaking clientele. For decades, the hotel continued to decline, all the while more people continued to take their lives in the hotel. However, this essentially became the norm for this hotel. It was a place for desperate, broken people. Organized crime, prostitution, and drugs became so commonplace that no one even really batted an eye. As a testament to just how disheveled this entire building was, on 2 different occasions, serial killers would call this hotel home. Then, in the early 2010s, the hotel underwent a drastic change. A plan was put forth where 2 hotels would be combined within this one building. The first half would remain the dirty and sketchy setup the hotel had had for years. The other half would be an upbeat, newer, and redesigned hotel that was meant to attract younger tourists who needed a cheap place to stay in LA. And all that was fine until February 2013, when one of the strangest missing persons cases would unfold and take the internet by storm. And that missing person was Elisa Lam. And the hotel we're talking about today is the infamous Cecil Hotel. Now, when I was first planning to do this video, I started it as to just be about the Elisa Lam case. But the more I researched the Elisa Lam case, the more I realized there was a lot of weird stuff with the Cecil Hotel itself. So I decided to take on the massive task of covering the hotel's entire history, including when it was built, all the confirmed deaths that have taken place at the hotel, the rumored stay of one of the most infamous murder victims in history, the confirmed stay of 2 of the most prolific serial killers in American history, as well as the Elisa Lam case, and then finally we'll talk about what is happening to the Cecil Hotel today. But due to how much information there really was about this hotel, I did have to make the decision to split this into 2 parts. Now, I haven't really done this since my Ouija series way back in the day, but there is just so much information here for me to try to even attempt to cover in one video. Now, luckily, unlike the Ouija series, this story and what we're going to cover is a lot more contained and easier to follow. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the history and tragedy of the Cecil Hotel. The Cecil Hotel was built in 1924 by hotelier William Hanner. The design was left to Loy Lester Smith, who chose an Art Deco style that has pretty much become synonymous with the Roaring Twenties in America. When it was finished, the Cecil was a 14-floor, 700-room hotel on Main Street in Los Angeles, California. Reportedly, the construction of the Cecil cost over $1 million, which in today's terms equates to roughly $20 million. As is evident by its price and design, Hanner intended for the Cecil to be a premier, glamorous hotel meant for businessmen and upper middle class tourists. And for the first few years, it was exactly that. However, as the 1920s came to a close, the Cecil was dealt a couple of heavy blows. First, in 1927, a man named Percy Cook died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head in his room at the Cecil. At the scene, authorities found a note Cook had addressed to the media, which stated that he had been planning to take his own life for a week, and it seemed to have been a result from him being unable to reconcile with his estranged wife and son. Now, the next blow came in 1929 when the world was plunged into the Great Depression. For the first year or so of the Depression, the Cecil did manage to stay pretty well kept and still bolstered a rather lavish clientele. However, as the Depression carried on, the Cecil would eventually have to change strategy and began renting out rooms for both short and long-term stays. To cut costs even further, every guest would still have their own room, but everyone had to use shared bathrooms on a single floor. So every floor had one shared bathroom for everyone on that floor. As the Depression continued, the Cecil was forced to continuously lower their price to stay afloat. But this began attracting more troublesome guests, especially due to the Cecil's close proximity to the rapidly growing area of Los Angeles known as Skid Row. Now, if you don't know, Skid Row is the official name for a community known as Central City East. In the late 1800s, Central City East became a haven for both sort of transient and permanent residents who were looking to find work in Los Angeles. Now, to accommodate all these workers, several hotels and apartments began opening in and around Central City East during the first couple decades of the 1900s. But when the Depression hit, many buildings were forced to close, and most residents were without work and shelter. It's estimated that at its peak in the 1930s, Skid Row was home to somewhere near 10,000 homeless people. Because of this, Skid Row soon became synonymous with crime and being home to a lot of downtrodden people. Soon, that crime and the unfortunate souls of Skid Row began making their way to places like the Cecil Hotel, which did offer low-cost housing. And of course, crime soon followed, and the Cecil soon became well known as a home for sex workers, drug dealers, and criminals in general. However, the Cecil gained another more morbid reputation in the 30s as a place where people came to die. In the 30s alone, 6 people would die while residing in the Cecil Hotel. First, we have W.K. Norton, who checked in November 1931 under a false name. A week later, the 46-year-old was found dead in his room, and his cause of death was attributed to ingesting poison, but authorities were never able to determine if he had taken his own life. Next, in September 1932, Benjamin Dodich was found dead in his room. The cause of death was listed as a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, and no note was found at the scene. He was 25 years old. In July 1934, 53-year-old Army Sergeant Louis Borden was found in his room after slitting his own throat with a razor. Borden had left multiple notes, all of which cited his deteriorating health as the reason for his actions. In March 1937, Grace Margot fell from a 9th-story window. Her fall was broken by some telephone wires, which were wrapped around her body when she hit the ground. Now, she did survive the initial fall, but would later succumb to her injuries in the hospital. Grace was 25 years old, and police were never able to determine if her fall was intentional or accidental. In January 1938, a Marine named Roy Thompson jumped from one of the higher floors of the Cecil and landed on the skylight of an adjacent building. Police later determined that the 35-year-old had taken his own life after living in the Cecil for the last few weeks. Lastly, in May 1939, 39-year-old Erwin Neblett died after intentionally ingesting poison. As the 1930s came to a close and the 1940s began, the Cecil only continued to diminish in quality and see a continuous rise in criminal activity. Additionally, the number of deaths in and around the Cecil only continued to grow as well. Also, as a quick side note, I want everyone to understand that the deaths we're going to be talking about today and in the next video are only the violent ones. We are not talking about the hundreds, maybe even thousands of deaths that have occurred due to overdoses, nor are we talking about the individuals who have died due to natural causes while inhabiting the Cecil. Every hotel you've ever seen or stayed in has probably had someone die in it. It's just part of life. You have these places that serve hundreds of people a day, and when you have that sort of influx of people, every so often a guest will most likely pass. However, when it comes to the Cecil, it sets itself apart by the sheer volume of deaths that happen inside its walls and how many of those deaths have a violent connotation. And, as I said, when the 1940s rolled around, the Cecil continued to see increases in crime due to the steady growth of the Skid Row community. And its death toll continued to rise when, in January 1940, a 45-year-old woman would take her own life while staying at the hotel. The woman was later identified as Dorothy Seeger and had died after ingesting poison. Beforehand, she had written a note to her family in which she indicated that she was planning to take her own life. But Dorothy was actually found still alive after ingesting the poison by a hotel worker who called the authorities. Dorothy was later rushed to the hospital, but would eventually pass away a couple of days after being checked in. After this, the Cecil would see a 4.5-year-long hiatus in violent deaths. However, the crime that took place in September 1944 was the most bizarre the Cecil had seen at the time. Now, this story revolves around a 19-year-old named Dorothy Jean Purcell, who was staying at the Cecil Hotel with her boyfriend, Benjamin Levine, who was 38. A few days into their stay, Purcell went into labor despite being unaware that she was pregnant. Afraid to wake Levine, Purcell went to the restroom, which, remember, is a shared restroom, and there she delivered the baby. However, after giving birth, Purcell believed the baby was stillborn, and for whatever reason, she decided to toss the baby out of the window of that restroom and returned to her room without telling Levine what had happened. Now, when that baby was tossed from the building, it landed on the roof of an adjacent building. The remains were found shortly after, and police soon arrested Purcell. Now, when an autopsy was performed, it was tragically discovered that the newborn, who was determined to be a boy, was actually alive before being tossed from the Cecil. After that discovery was made, Purcell was then charged with murder, but during her trial, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. After this, the Cecil would see another break in violent crimes until 1947. In November 1947, 35-year-old Robert Smith died after jumping from a window on the 7th floor. But earlier in that year, in January 1947, it was rumored that the Cecil had been briefly inhabited by Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short was born in Boston, Massachusetts on July 29, 1924. When Short was 6, her father lost most of the family's savings due to the stock market crash, and soon after, he disappeared, with the family assuming he had taken his own life. Around age 15, it was determined that Short had bronchitis and suffered severe asthma attacks, which eventually led her to having to undergo lung surgery. Afterward, the doctor recommended that Short spend time in a milder climate, so her mother began sending her to Miami, Florida to stay with relatives during her winter breaks. During her sophomore year of high school, Short decided to drop out and would frequently interchange her visits to Miami and Boston. Then, in late 1942, Short's mother received a letter from her husband explaining that he was still alive, but had abandoned her and their kids to start a new life in California. Soon after, Short, who was 18 at the time, decided to move to California to live with her father. Now, Short never gave a reason for why she decided to do this, but it's likely due to Short's aspiration to be an actress and her possible belief that California would allow her to pursue that dream. However, in early 1943, Short moved out of the house and moved in with a man she was seeing. A few months later, Short claimed that her partner was abusing her and she moved to Santa Barbara. Then, in September 1943, Short was arrested at a bar for underage drinking. Following that arrest, juvenile authorities sent Short back to her home in Boston. Short, however, quickly moved back to Florida and after this would very rarely visit Boston. 3 years later, in July 1946, Short moved to Los Angeles with an acquaintance. By January 1947, Short was living on Hollywood Boulevard and had a job as a waitress. On January 9th, 1947, Short returned to Los Angeles after a day trip to San Diego. However, she wasn't dropped off at the apartment she was renting. Instead, she was dropped off at the Biltmore Hotel by the man she was dating at the time. During her brief stay at the hotel, the employees reported that Short was acting very frantic and had used the telephone in the lobby multiple times that night. Around 10 p.m. that night, a very distressed Short left the Biltmore, and that would be the last time anyone would see Short alive. 6 days later, on the morning of January 15th, 1947, Elizabeth Short's body was discovered by a mother and daughter who were on a walk in Leimert Park in Los Angeles. At first, the mother believed that the corpse was a mannequin due to its sort of pure white complexion and the odd way that the limbs were contorted. However, once she got closer, she realized that it was the corpse of a woman who had been severed at the waist. Obviously, the woman then called the police, who discovered that not only had Short's body been bisected, but also a number of her organs had been removed, and her body had been drained of a large quantity of blood. Due to this, it was determined that Short was killed elsewhere, and her body was later dumped in Leimert Park. Additionally, medical examiners noticed several bruises and cuts on Short's head. Of these scars, the most notable was the presence of what is known as a Glasgow smile, which is created when someone is cut from the side of their mouth to go up to their ears, which gives them the illusion of a constant smile. Later, the examiners would estimate that Short had died roughly 10 or so hours before she was discovered. Lastly, investigators noted that Short's body had been posed to have her hands above her head and her legs had been spread, which is likely why the woman who discovered the body originally thought it was a mannequin. Before sending the body to autopsy, police took fingerprints from the corpse and sent them to the FBI through a sound photo machine. Hours later, due to her earlier arrest for underage drinking, the FBI confirmed the prints belonged to Short. However, from the time of her discovery, Short had been referred to in reports as the Black Dahlia. Now, interestingly, this doesn't seem to be a name that reporters just made up. Instead, witnesses who had seen Short before commonly knew her as the Black Dahlia. The exact origin of this name isn't really known, but it is likely a combination of a movie title and Short's clothing style. In 1946, a film noir and crime film named The Blue Dahlia was released. As for Short's style, alongside her jet black hair, she commonly wore all black clothing, which led to many people in the surrounding area dubbing her the Black Dahlia. On January 16th, 1947, a day after the body was discovered, an autopsy was performed. During the autopsy, it was discovered that Short had ligature marks around her ankles, wrists, and neck, as well as cuts on her breasts and thighs. As for the bisection, the coroner determined that due to there being very little bruising where the incisions were, the dismemberment had occurred after Short was already dead. Later, it would be determined that Short's cause of death was hemorrhaging from the cuts on her face, as well as shock from repeated blows to the head. For the next 3 years, the LAPD would investigate Short's death before shutting it down in 1950. During that time, hundreds of suspects were investigated, dozens of clues and leads were pursued, but nothing substantial was ever discovered. And to this day, Short's murder remains unsolved. Now, everything I just covered is a very compact version of the Black Dahlia case, because it's a case that I can and probably will cover in full at a later time. But for now, all we need is the gist of her story and her connection to the Cecil Hotel. So, how is Short connected to the Cecil Hotel? Well, it seems to be very loosely. By the time of the Black Dahlia case, the Cecil already had its sinister reputation due to everything we've covered so far. So, rumors began that Short had been residing at the Cecil just before her murder. But these were just rumors. There was never any solid evidence to connect Short and the hotel. But for some, it only made sense that the victim of one of the most wicked crimes in LA would somehow be connected to one of the most wicked locations in LA. Now, I'm not going to say it's impossible that Short ever stayed in the Cecil. It is totally possible that she did. However, there is no direct evidence for that claim. And despite that, many people will still credit the Cecil with being a home for the Black Dahlia. Following the rumored stay of the Black Dahlia and the confirmed stay of Robert Smith, the Cecil would see a 7-year hiatus in violent deaths. Then, in October 1954, 55-year-old Helen Gurney leaped from a window on the 7th floor and landed on the hotel's marquee sign. Gurney, who had died instantly from the fall, had checked into the Cecil a week earlier and had registered under a false name. 8 years later, in February 1962, a 50-year-old woman named Julia Frances Moore took her own life by jumping from a window on the 8th floor. Later that year, in October 1962, the Cecil would see another odd case when 27-year-old Pauline Otten jumped from a window on one of the upper levels of the hotel. Now, prior to her jump, other guests had heard Otten arguing with a man in her room. Later, it would be discovered that the man was Otten's estranged husband, and the two had had an argument which led Otten to take her own life. Now, where the story gets odd, however, is the ground, because next to Otten, there was another body. That body belonged to 65-year-old George Gianni. Now, during the investigation, police believed Otten and Gianni had both jumped at the same time, but it would later be determined that Gianni's injuries and body position weren't consistent with someone jumping out of a window. Instead, it was determined that Otten had landed on Gianni after jumping from her window, and the impact killed both of them instantly. Nearly 2 years later, in June 1964, the Cecil would see its most brutal crime up to that point. That crime was the murder of a 65-year-old Los Angeles local known as Pigeon Goldie Osgood. Osgood was well known in Los Angeles and received her nickname Pigeon Goldie because she was often seen feeding the birds in the nearby Pershing Square Park. But on June 4th, 1964, a hotel worker found Osgood dead in her room. When authorities arrived, they discovered that Osgood had been sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times, and ultimately beaten to death. A few hours later, a man named Jacques Ellinger was seen in Pershing Square and was reportedly covered in blood. Soon after, Ellinger was arrested and charged with the murder, but was quickly cleared of the crime. Now, why exactly he was cleared was never released. No other suspects were ever identified, and to this day, Osgood's case remains unsolved. Over a decade later, in December 1975, a woman estimated to be in her early 20s jumped from the 12th floor to her death. A week earlier, the woman had checked in under the name Allison Lowell, but this was believed to be a pseudonym because no one ever came forward to claim the body. The true identity of this woman has never been revealed. Next, the Cecil Hotel would go without a violent death for 17 years. But just because nothing violent was taking place in the hotel doesn't mean the hotel wasn't home to violent people. In fact, two of America's most prolific serial killers would call the Cecil home for a time during the mid-80s and the early 90s. Those two serial killers are Richard Ramirez and Jack Unterweger. Throughout 1984 and 1985, the cities of Los Angeles and San Francisco were gripped with fear due to a string of grisly murders and assaults. This killer used a wide variety of weapons, including handguns, knives, and blunt objects. In several cases, the victims were also strangled or even tortured. As the investigation progressed and it became clear that a serial killer was responsible, detectives identified a pattern. This perpetrator would break into victims' homes, assault and murder them, and then burglarize the residences. Due to these patterns, the killer earned several nicknames. Of these, the most infamous was known as the Night Stalker. In late August 1985, James Romero Jr. and his son, James III, returned to their home in Los Angeles. Later on the night of their return, James III was working in the garage of the home while his father slept, but he realized he needed something from the car, from the family's car, so he went outside to check, but when he did, he heard something sort of rustling in the yard. Now, James kind of looked around and investigated, but he was unable to spot anything that was really out of place. But After grabbing what he needed and going back inside, James started to hear footsteps outside the home, and fearing that there was an intruder on their property, he went upstairs. He went to his upstairs bedroom and looked out the window to the backyard. Sure enough, James spotted someone in the yard and woke up his father. Soon after, the pair saw this intruder fleeing and went outside to see where he went. However, after this, they saw the intruder get into a vehicle, which the Ramirez told police was an orange Toyota, and they did give a partial license plate number for that vehicle. Later that same night, the Night Stalker broke into the home of Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson. He silently entered the couple's bedrooms and shot Carnes in the head 3 times with a handgun. After this, the intruder then turned his attention to Erickson and claimed he was the Night Stalker. He then beat Erickson, assaulted her, and demanded all the cash and jewelry in the home. Before leaving, he told Erickson, who the Night Stalker had tied up, to tell the authorities that this was the work of the Night Stalker. Later, Erickson managed to untie herself and ran to the neighbor's home to ask for help. Now, miraculously, surgeons were able to remove the bullets from Carnes' head, and he survived. Now, the experiences of the Ramirez, Carnes, and Erickson were crucial to the investigation in the Night Stalker case. Erickson was able to give a detailed description of her assailant to investigators, and a few days later, the orange Toyota the Ramirez described was found abandoned in Koreatown, Los Angeles. In the vehicle, on the rearview mirror, investigators found a single fingerprint, even though it was obvious to them that the culprit had thoroughly cleaned out the car. Now, this single fingerprint was positively identified as belonging to a 25-year-old from Texas named Richard Ramirez. Police described Ramirez as a drifter who already had an extensive rap sheet, which included multiple illicit drug charges, grand theft auto, and numerous assault charges. Then, on August 29, 1985, authorities released a mugshot of Ramirez and listed him as the top suspect in the Night Stalker murders. However, Ramirez was totally unaware that he had been identified, and on August 30th, 1985, he returned to LA after visiting his brother in Arizona. After his arrival, the first thing Ramirez noticed was that there was an increased police presence on basically every street. Worrying that the police now were onto him, Ramirez sort of slipped into this convenience store in eastern LA to hide, but the workers of this store recognized him from his mugshot that was plastered on the newspapers the store was selling. Realizing now that he had been identified, Ramirez fled the store and attempted to steal a Ford Mustang, but he was pulled from the vehicle by 2 bystanders who had also recognized him. After this, Ramirez then attempted to take a woman's keys and steal her car, but the woman's husband was close by, and after seeing what Ramirez was trying to do, he struck Ramirez in the back of the head with a fence post. Ramirez then fled on foot, but by that point, a small mob of about 10 people had formed and chased Ramirez. Soon, the group restrained him and severely beat him. Another bystander saw this attack happening and called the police, who, when they arrived, they broke up the group and took a very battered Ramirez into custody. Ramirez wouldn't go to trial for these crimes until nearly 3 years later in August 1988. During his first court appearance, Ramirez drew a pentagram on his hand with a marker and shouted out, "Hail Satan," which, if this were a video about Ramirez, I would sort of go deeper into, but obviously this isn't about him. But long story short, Ramirez used a lot of satanic imagery to invoke fear in people. During one portion of this trial, one of the jurors failed to appear and would later be discovered shot to death in her home. Now, when this came to light, the rest of the jury became terrified that Ramirez had somehow ordered a hit on that juror and wondered if he would come after them too. But it would later be discovered that the juror had been killed by her boyfriend, who later took his own life. Just to sort of show you how terrified people were of Ramirez, The replacement juror was too terrified of him to even return home. And during the entire trial, she basically lived in a hotel until like he was convicted. And speaking of, on September 20th, 1989, Ramirez was found guilty and convicted of a grand total of 43 charges, which included 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. For these crimes, Ramirez was sentenced to death via the gas chamber. However, due to California's shaky history and legislation surrounding the death penalty, Ramirez's penalty was postponed multiple times. Due to this, Ramirez attempted to file numerous appeals and even attempted to receive a rehearing, but all of these were, of course, denied, and the sentencing was upheld. Then, on June 7th, 2013, Ramirez died of lymphoma at 53 years old. Medical examiners noted that Ramirez was also affected by chronic substance abuse and a hepatitis C infection. Upon his death, friends and families of his victims celebrated, and one LA police officer even said, "One of the darkest chapters of LA's history was now closed." So, how is the Cecil connected? Due to the Cecil's shady nature by the 1980s, and the fact that most tenants paid cash for their rooms, not many records were kept about who was at the hotel at any given time. However, numerous reliable sources who were staying in and around the Cecil Hotel at that time reported seeing Ramirez at the hotel amid his sort of killing spree. From these sources, it's believed that Ramirez had stayed in a low-cost room on the hotel's 14th floor. And since the Cecil was well on the decline by the 1980s, Ramirez was rumored to return to the hotel in blood-stained clothes, and no one bothered to question it. In one instance, Ramirez reportedly stripped off a blood-stained outfit, threw it away in the hotel's dumpster, and walked back to his room completely naked. After seeing everyone's sort of disposition at the hotel to one of America's most prolific serial killers, you might not be surprised to hear that just 6 or 7 years later, another serial killer would call the Cecil home. And that killer's name was Jack Unterweger. On June 20th, 1991, 35-year-old Shannon Exley's body was found strangled with her bra in an abandoned lot in LA. 2 weeks later, the body of 33-year-old Irene Rodriguez was found near the LA River. She too had been strangled with her own bra, and investigators noted that both times the bra had been tied with the same technique. Then, on July 10th, 1991, 26-year-old Peggy Booth's body was found near a freeway. And just like the previous victims, Booth had been strangled with her bra, which was once again tied in the same fashion. And 2 times is a coincidence, 3 times is a pattern. So police were now very confident that there was now another serial killer on the loose in Los Angeles. These killings, however, ended just as quickly as they began. Once those cases started being reported in the media, though, authorities in Austria noted that these cases matched the MO of a criminal who had been imprisoned in their country before, named Jack Unterweger. Born in 1950 in Austria, Johann Jack Unterweger's first run-in with the law came in 1966 when he stole money from 2 guests at the hotel where he was employed. Following this, Jack sort of became a drifter, and between the years of 1966 and 1974, he would be convicted over a dozen times for various offenses, which included theft, pimping, and sexual assault. Then, in December 1974, Jack and his at-the-time girlfriend Barbara Scholz burglarized the home of Scholz's parents in Western Germany. During the burglary, Scholz's friend, 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer, caught them in the act. Now, somehow Jack convinced Schaefer to come along with them after the burglary, but he would later attack her when the group reached an abandoned parking lot. After that, Jack tied up Schaefer, marched her into a patch of forest, sexually assaulted her, and then strangled her to death. Post-mortem, Jack removed Schaefer's bra and tied it around her neck, which, as we know, would later become his calling card of sorts. It would only take about a month for Jack to be arrested for another crime, and following that arrest, police quickly connected him to the murder of Schaefer. And this was due to Jack's extensive rap sheet he already had, and his prior history of violence against women. Also, Jack was sort of just nonchalant about the murder, and on a few occasions would brag to people about the crime. And because of that, he was quickly convicted of the crime and was sentenced to life in prison on June 1st, 1976. Following his imprisonment, Jack began teaching himself how to read and write. Soon, he began writing short stories, poems, and he even wrote an autobiography. In that autobiography, Jack used his imprisonment to speak about class conflict and discrimination against people considered to be poor. In this autobiography, he also claimed that his imprisonment was harsh due to his troubled childhood, but he conveniently left out his extensive rap sheet of violent crimes, and never once in any of his writings did he bring up the murder of Schaefer. But many people began to view Unterweger's writing and self-education as a clear-cut example of criminal reform. And in 1985, a campaign to pardon Jack was launched in Austria. This movement garnered support from Austrian writers, journalists, and even politicians. And in May 1990, Jack Unterweger was released from prison, and almost overnight, he became a pseudo-celebrity. Soon after this, Unterweger began appearing on Austrian radio and television shows to discuss his rehabilitation and his newfound interest in criminal journalism. And from that new interest in criminal journalism, he soon landed a job as a journalist for an Austrian radio station. And as luck would have it, Jack would have an extensive string of crimes to investigate beginning in September 1990. That month, which was only 3 months after Unterweger's release, the body of a 30-year-old woman was discovered next to a river in Prague. Investigators determined the woman's cause of death was strangulation, and wouldn't you know it, she had her bra tied around her neck. This crime would mark the beginning of a string of at least 7 murders, all of which involved a female victim that was strangled to death with some form of undergarments being wrapped around the neck. Now, Jack reported on nearly all of these crimes and had an oddly intricate knowledge about these cases. But due to his knowledge, and his reporting, Unterweger was hired by an Austrian magazine to travel overseas to Los Angeles and report on the city's prostitution and the violence that was inflicted upon women in that profession. Soon after he departed, authorities in Austria became suspicious of Unterweger and began investigating him in connection with the numerous cases we just discussed. That suspicion only grew when several sex workers began showing up dead in LA almost immediately after Unterweger arrived in the city. If you recall, a total of 3 women would be murdered by strangulation over the course of about 3 weeks. These 3 weeks align exactly with Jack's stay at the Cecil Hotel. And unlike Ramirez, Unterweger's stay is 100% confirmed. Travel records indicate that he had arrived in LA in mid-June 1991. Additionally, he checked into the hotel with his real name, and those documents were kept in the hotel's records. However, he only stayed in the hotel for about a month because once suspicion started to grow and he caught wind of Austria's investigation, Unterweger fled back to Europe and went on the run. From August 1991 to February 1992, Unterweger was continuously on the run throughout Switzerland, France, and would eventually return to the US, where he would later be captured in Florida. Following his arrest, Jack was extradited back to Austria in May 1992 where 2 years later, in June 1994, he was convicted of 9 murders, which resulted in him being sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. But on the night of his conviction, Unterweger hanged himself in his cell, and the makeshift rope he used was tied with the same knot that was found on all of his victims. Following Unterweger's stay in 91, the hotel would see its next death on September 1st, 1992. That day, the body of an African American male was found in the alley beside the Cecil. Now, police were confident that the man had fallen from one of the hotel's upper floors. Whether or not he was pushed or if he jumped himself was never discovered. In fact, almost nothing has been found about this man. Police were never able to positively identify him, and no one ever came forward to claim the body. And to this day, that case remains unsolved. After this case, the Cecil would go over 2 decades without any sort of violent crime or death. But during this time, the Cecil would see some major changes in its business aspect. Throughout the remainder of the 90s and well into the early 2000s, the hotel continued its decline due to the continuous growth of the Skid Row area. Additionally, during that 2 decades, ownership had swapped for the hotel multiple times, and every new owner would attempt to renovate and or rebuild the Cecil Hotel, but they all would eventually give up and sell the hotel. Then, in 2011, the at the time owners of the Cecil came up with an idea. The plan was to section off portions of the hotel and turn those sections into an entirely new type of residence. This residence would be named the Stay on Main, and it would have an entirely different entrance, lobby, and style compared to the Cecil. Essentially, the Cecil Hotel section of this building would remain exactly the same. However, a handful of floors would be reserved for guests of the Stay on Main, which was more akin to what the Cecil originally was when it was meant for middle class travelers. The Stay on Main floors would also be remodeled to have their own color scheme and style to complement the clientele they were looking to attract. All seemed well and good with this idea, only if it wasn't for one big issue. Since the Stay on Main was still part of the Cecil Hotel, the two shared amenities like the elevators and stairwells. In these locations, guests of the Stay on Main would often come in contact with the more downtrodden and often unpredictable tenants of the Cecil Hotel. But this didn't really do much to dissuade travelers who saw the Stay on Main as a good deal for a cheap stay in LA. That was until mid-February 2013, residents throughout the entire building began complaining about issues with the water in the hotel. Those issues included low water pressure, discoloration, and the tap water having an odd taste. Following these complaints, a maintenance worker was sent to check the water towers on top of the building, and there, the worker found the hatch of one of the tanks open, and in that tank, he saw the lifeless, naked body of a woman. When police arrived on the scene, they emptied the water tank and had to cut a section out of the side to retrieve the body. Once the body was recovered, investigators quickly determined that they had found the remains of a girl who had gone missing nearly 3 weeks prior. That girl's name was Elisa Lam. And that's where we'll pick back up in the next episode when we finish the story of the Cecil Hotel. And after everything we just discussed, there's still a lot left to cover. Of course, in the next episode, we're going to talk about the Elisa Lam story, which, as I said back in the beginning, was what this entire video was originally going to be about before I decided to switch over to do the whole Cecil Hotel. Also, after we do the Elisa Lam section, we'll talk about what's happened to the Cecil following the case and also kind of what's going on at the Cecil Hotel today. So yeah, we have a lot left to cover, but it should be a lot of fun. Now, all I ask is that if you enjoyed the video, I would ask you to please leave a like and maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. Those are the best ways to help me out, and it tells me that you all enjoy what I'm doing here. Also, I want to thank everyone for being patient while waiting for this video. Um, Following my last video, the Chicago Tylenol murders video, I sort of fell into like this creative slump and didn't have much enthusiasm to really work on anything for this channel. But slowly but surely, I can feel the sort of passion for this coming back to me, and I'm hoping to get more stuff out for you all soon. But I don't really have any information about what's coming soon. I'm just gonna keep working on some stuff. Um, Part 2 of this video will be coming. I don't have a time frame for anything at all. I'm just working on it when I get the chance to. And I appreciate you again all for being so patient. The only thing I will say is there might be a different video between episode 1 and 2 of this. Like I said, I don't really know yet. But with all of that said, thank you all again so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And as always, I hope to see you all again very soon.